Hi folks, this is Tacitus Today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for watching, and while you're with us, please subscribe below and also click on the bell symbol for notifications. This essay posits the question, is globalization really lifting third world peasants out of poverty? We see a lot of headlines such as these claiming hundreds of millions of poor third world peasants are being lifted out of poverty by the altruistic benefits of globalization. It's good for everybody on the planet, or so the articles state, and makes the big banks appear socially very virtuous. But what is the reality? Are hundreds of millions of people really being lifted out of poverty? And is it a net benefit to all populations, as is alleged? Or are money and jobs just being moved around from well-run, peaceful, productive economies to poorer, dysfunctional regions, artificially creating a different set of winners and losers, but without any actual tangible all-round benefit? Is the whole thing of peasant salvation merely a myth, just a statistical conjuring act? Okay, so these groups such as the World Bank are hardline spruikers of globalisation, have been so since it all began. They depict globalisation as nothing but benign, with Western workers needing to shape up and just suck up the consequences, which have turned out to be falling standards of living. One lecture I attended from the editor of a major international financial journal, and typical of globalisation's most ardent economic spruikers, was in his 30s, white, born into money, married into even more money, and enjoyed a meteoric rise to corporate prominence. He lives within luxurious, secure communities and gets paid more than $1 million per year before bonuses. Only 1 in every 1,000 people in the rich West live in such bountiful circumstances. His message was globalisation is good, don't have to tell you how or why. It's going to happen whether you like it or not, so get used to it. Western workers must now compete for their jobs and pay conditions with peasant workers in third world countries, and that's just how it's going to be. Forced mass migration to the West and multiculturalism are good things. Anyone who disagrees is a simpleton and or a bigot. Now, in the audience there were carefully placed stooges who called out Nazi or fascist so as to silence anyone who questioned the export of Western jobs to the third world or forced mass migration to the West. And this was used, of course, to cow any others who might be thinking of asking such obvious and necessary questions. To the question of would he, in the interests of globalisation, of course, give his $1 million plus a year job to, say, an Indian economic journalist who would work happily for a tenth of his salary, the answer was a big no. Globalisation is a chill wind with consequences exclusively for Western middle and working classes, not for elites such as him. No, sir. The idea of him competing for his job in a globalised labour market was preposterous. Grubby competition and uncertainty was for others to endure. Okay, so let's look now at statistics and definitions. By redefining what constitutes poverty or extreme poverty, international banking organisations can retrospectively declare a group of people to be in or out of poverty simply by moving around the definition goalposts. Nothing may actually have changed, they just use different definitions. For example, let's say the definition for American poverty was, I don't know, any individual who owns less than 10 cars. So statistically, by this measure of 10 cars per individual, we can say that 99% of Americans live in poverty. But the next year we remove that definition and change it so only 1 car is the measure. And suddenly the headline can appear, 80% of Americans were lifted out of poverty. Nothing's actually changed from one year to the next. The Conjuring Act was achieved by redefining the reality from 10 cars to 1 car. It was all down to the definition, and so it is with defining world poverty. Imaginative use of definitions to create sensational headlines is increasingly the go-to standard of journalism and propaganda of our times. One women's activist group, for example, asserts alleged catcalling is actually conflated rape thoughts, which they then reconflate to claim attempted rape. So just by playing around with definitions to fit a preconceived narrative, headlines of studies have shown 1 in 2 women suffers attempted rape can be cast around when in fact no attempted rape has occurred. It's just a matter of definitions and how you use them. So looking past the alchemy of politicised definitions, how many people have actually been lifted out of poverty due to globalisation, and how much of this is due to manipulation of statistical definitions on one hand, or simply taking wealth and jobs from Western workers and moving it to the third world developing nations. Lifting people out of poverty is a good thing, and if it's due to a net addition to global wealth that benefits all of us, that would be something to celebrate. But is that really happening here? Again, we have the question, is globalization creating a bunch of new wealth, making everybody better off, or stealing a bunch of Western jobs and relocating those jobs to the third world? In 2001, more than 1 billion people in India and China were rural subsistence farmers, living a hand-to-mouth barter existence. They didn't really use money and produced little or no economic surplus. From a statistical economic point of view, they didn't really exist. However, when one of these people moves to a city for work and working for $2 per day in a factory, they are deemed statistically as having been lifted out of poverty or over the poverty threshold of $1.85 or so a day that applies to many undeveloped parts of the world. The poverty threshold, of course, differs country to country. In many advanced economies, $50 a day is the poverty line. In a lower middling economy, $7 to $10 a day may be the threshold. Similarly, purchasing power differs region to region. In a poor country, $2 can buy nearly 25 pounds of rice or 12 kilograms of rice, whereas it can cost 20 times that amount in a wealthier nation. So the reality here is that a worker moved from a subsistence farming existence to a city factory job, which is not in any way a lifting out of poverty, it is just moving human capital to a different statistical place on the balance sheet. Moreover, so the subsistence farmer owns his modest home on the farm and lives off the land, as it were, and so has very few material living expenses. A small surplus in rice can be bartered for candles or cloth or fuel and so on. By moving to a factory job in the city for a wage of $2 per day, the worker must now meet various expenses that he didn't have to meet previously, such as food and accommodation. If anything, his quality of life declines, even though statistically he appears better off. This is not a lifting out of poverty, as is often claimed. But if globalization is a benefit to the global economy and all or even most workers in the developing economies, it should be seen as adding net value to the world economy and, of course, the Western economies as well. If, however, wealth is simply being moved around and being taken from Western workers, and this is how jobs and wealth are being created in the developing economies, then the all-round benefits are minimal or may barely exist at all. So let's look at the proportion of GDP spent on wages and salaries, which is labour compensation, in the wealthy Western nations since 2001. This will indicate if wages and wage purchasing power are declining, rising or stagnating in the West. On average, worker compensation has, in aggregated terms, fallen from the low 50% of total GDP in 2001 to an average of mid-40% in 2017. That's a considerable fall. A similar picture emerges looking at the proportion of total incomes to gross national product, and this has fallen by 6.5% over the same period in the West, and much more than that if inflation of food, energy, housing and sundry costs are factored in. Much of this lost Western wealth has simply reappeared in developing economies, so there's no net gain for the whole globe or the global trading system to see here. In rough numbers, therefore, the United States alone transferred more than $500 billion of its own wealth from the American worker to the economies of the developing world. Since 2001, therefore, this means literally trillions have been taken out of the pockets of the American workers and the American economy at large, including the tax revenue base. And this has all been sent to subsidise or even outright buy jobs in developing nations. The same pattern exists across much of the Western world, with Germany being among some notable exceptions. German exports of advanced engineered goods to, for example, China and India have actually increased over this time. If we account for the total value of the declining proportion of labour compensation in the West since 2001, and compare this to the increase in the number of jobs and increasing GDP in the developing nations, there is a remarkably close parallel between the two. Perhaps 3/4 plus of all new wealth and new jobs created in developing nations has been taken straight out of the cities, towns and pay packets of Western workers. That is, the new total global wealth generated by globalization is quite small when considered in proportion to the cost of achieving such an outcome. The Western economies are spending almost $2 to get $1 in return for the privilege of participating by these rules in a so-called globalized economy. Globalization propagandists point to the increasing volume of world trade, yet here again definitions are everything. Intra-nation trade, where American-based manufacturers sell to American consumers, does not appear in international trade figures, but move that American factory and thousands of other factories to, say, China, and they make goods in China and then sell them back to the United States, then these figures do appear in international trade numbers. Moreover, supply chains that transport, part integrate products and then transport them on again to another link in the supply chain have the effect of double or triple counting so-called international trade, providing the inflationary effect to the numbers. So is globalization generating even some new wealth? Sure it is, but at a high cost, which is disproportionately being borne by the Western workers through lost factories and workplaces, lost jobs, and ever bleaker future job prospects. Are third world workers being lifted out of poverty, as is widely claimed by globalization's salesmen? Well, some are, but when we take out the number of subsistence peasant farmers who are just being moved like fodder around the balance sheet from the figures, the actual number escaping poverty is in reality very small, perhaps less than 10% of the figures claimed. The wealth in the developing nations, with occasional exception, is principally accumulated by ruling party hacks and those at the apex of a culturally stratified society. Most of the billionaires in the world are now in China. It is true the West has gained the mirage of higher living standards by accessing cheaper and much lower quality consumer goods manufactured in the developing economies. But even here, calculating loss of American tax revenue from all those manufacturing and other jobs sent to peasant economies means all those cheap consumer goods have been dearly paid for by losses elsewhere in the Western economies. Moreover, capital that's technically at least freed up from closing a factory is not redeploying in the West once it is gone. So this is not a scenario where new industries and new investments are appearing to replace those lost. Throughout economic history, and certainly modern economics, all those nations who have gained entrance to playing at a significant level in the world economy have brought something technically and or organisationally significant to the table. European customers bought British-made manufactured goods in the 1800s because they were better made, better quality and better value and more readily available. German engineers brought precision-engineered goods to the world. America brought labour-saving devices, interchangeable parts and mass production. Japan brought advanced organisational manufacturing adaptations that changed the world of consumer goods manufacturing. That Germany, the US and Japan developed home industries, initially at least behind tariffs in the case of Japan, tariff approximations such as exchange rate manipulation, is beside the material point of the valuable innovations they all provided as a price for entrance to the world economy. As each new technically or organisationally advanced entrant joined the game of the world economy, adjustments were made by the other and by the existing players. But these economic adjustments still left the world economy better off, more productive and more technically advanced overall. Globalisation in the current age, at least so far, has seen the developing economies of China and India contributing nothing to the advancement of the world economy other than cheap labour. No new innovations, no new technology and no organisational development. Cheap labour, that's it. Whatever purchasing power these hugely populous states have has been brought by the revenue gained from transplanting Western jobs and manufacturing to these developing economies. Even more critical still, the Chinese and Indian industrial space is much less productive in terms of output than the West. Therefore, world productivity of output has declined, while due to wage arbitrage, that is, cheap wages in the developing economies, productivity of capital has increased. So productivity of output is around 500% lower in global terms, while productivity of capital deployed is 20% higher. Incorporating an industrious Poland, Lithuania or Czech Republic to the Western economies has its challenges, but can be done to everyone's gain without obvious long-term international pain. But to integrate 2 billion peasant workers from peasant agrarian economies with nothing but cheap labour to offer is a mammoth task, and not one that can be glibly handled by stealing Western jobs and giving them away for so little in return. This is an arrangement that suits Western financial elites and their flunkies, but no one else, least of all the Western worker. This is Tacitus Today, your pushback channel. We hope you found this essay informative, and thank you for listening. All our essays are available in printed book format, so please select any 15 of our essays and email your order to the email address below.